Thank you, Steve. So my sermon this morning is called The Promise of Poetry. And the reason I picked that theme, well, there's two reasons, really. So I'm going to give you one and then even more honest reason. The one is that it's National Poetry Month, and so it seemed like an appropriate time, given everything that was occurring in the world, for us to just step back a little bit and think about poetry, because I think that would be a very good exercise for us. The second reason is I was invited at Yale Divinity School to also give a talk this week, and I thought, well, I'm going to speak on poetry there, so I'll get to speak to two audiences about poetry. So I already had this written, and I thought, why not deliver it here on Fisher's Island as well? So there you go. So I hope it goes even better the second time around. So the reason that I want to talk about this is because I think National Poetry Month invites us to reflect on our relationship to poetry. While I'm not a poet, poets and poetry have blessed my life enormously. My paternal grandfather was a published poet, and as a young teenager, I recall him reading his works at Carnegie Hall. And my cousin, Eleni Sikilianos, is an award-winning poet who teaches at Brown University. And of course, we also have lighthouse works on the island, bringing poets in each of their cohorts to us to do readings. And, you know, we really are exposed to just wonderful poets throughout the year. So it's a blessing. And I want to ask you, how has poetry shaped your own life? Do you have a poet that you like to read over and over again? And are there poets whose verses you have memorized through the years? This is a real question. Like, are there poets that you like to read? Anyone want to volunteer that, you know, a favorite poet?
Robert Frost.
Robert Frost, a wonderful poet of nature.
You asked the question. I happen to have read a poem at a memorial service for our Bob Patterson, on Friday, by John Masefield, called Sea Fever, which is a wonderful mariner's poem and reflects on Bob's passion for boating in the sea.
Well, that sounds wonderful. It's not a poem I know. Do you recollect any verses from it?
No, but my wife, Cindy, was required to memorize that poem, she tells me, in fifth grade.
Okay. We're not going to ask you to stand and recite, though. Don't worry.
The first line is, I must down to the sea again.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Anyone else? Well, I'll share with you that one of my favorite poets that I've actually mentioned to you before in a previous sermon is Czesław Miłosz. Is anyone familiar with Miłosz besides the fact that I mentioned him in a sermon before? No. Okay, so I'm going to talk about him a little bit because reading Miłosz I've been reading him for about 25 years. I think I discovered him, you know, sort of towards, maybe a little bit longer, because towards the end of the 90s. And he's influenced my journey of faith as much as any theologian. And of course, you know, like, that is my practice. So he's been important to me. But let me tell you a little bit about who Miłosz is or was, and then maybe I'll read a poem or two. So Miłosz was a Polish-speaking poet who grew up in and around the city of Vilnius, then under Polish sovereignty. And in his life, he encapsulated the traumas of the 20th century, from the cataclysm of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944 to the grimness of daily existence under communist dictatorship. By strange twists of providence, Miłosz immigrated to the United States and became a professor of Slavic languages and literature at the University of California in Berkeley. And in 1980, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. In his poetry, Miłosz grapples between the contrasts of the death and destruction he experienced in Poland and the kind of tranquil idyll that he came to inhabit in the Berkeley Hills. How can such historical violence and earthly beauty be reconciled? Now you see why I think this is relevant for us in the times that we're living in, because we're living in a place of great earthly beauty, but there's such violence around the world. How can this be reconciled? That was Miłosz's question. What kind of God would allow both to coincide? Now for Miłosz, the moral role of memory occupies a central place in his oeuvre. Miłosz came to regard his vocation as an author as bearing witnesses to the atrocities he had experienced, however tempting and salutary it might be for him to forget them and move on. And the weight of that responsibility toward the past edged him eventually towards Roman Catholicism. He had grown up in a Roman Catholic milieu, but was never really a devoted church member, but became more and more so because of these questions that he was wrestling with. He never really liked to be called a Christian poet, though. As a writer, he maintained his freedom, questioning divine decrees and entertaining heretical ideas. And naturally, if you read the Bible, you know that these types of questioning God take place in the Bible too, which is why Miłosz loved reading the Psalms and the book of Job in particular. Now, in the 1970s, Miłosz began to translate the Psalms from Hebrew into Polish, in part because he felt the existing Polish translations didn't do justice to the biblical text, but also in part as a spiritual exercise to ground himself in a period of personal suffering and travail. Now, if you're going to translate the Psalms, you also need to learn Hebrew, which Miłosz didn't know. So, at something like the age of 50, he went out and started learning Hebrew, which I think is encouraging to us all. So he taught himself Hebrew to the point that he could do those translations, and he started attending the Professional Society of Biblical Scholars, which is called the Society of Biblical Literature, to become acquainted with current biblical scholarship. So he really took this task very seriously. And though he undertook the translation of the Psalms for essentially personal reasons, his rendering of the biblical poems gained unexpected public significance in Poland by the end of the decade. This is a little bit of history. In December 1970, the former communist government of Poland used lethal force to suppress strikes by shipyard workers in the city of Gdansk and elsewhere in northern Poland. And after the workers and the government reached a modus vivendi, very uneasy, in 1980, supporters of the nascent Solidarity movement commissioned a sculpture to record the names of those slain during the strike. The resulting work is titled The Monument to the Fallen Shipyard Workers of 1970. It's composed of 3 steel beams that rise about 140 feet into the air, and then they have crossbars at their summit with then ship's anchors at the top. And they hearken back very self-consciously to the 3 crosses at Golgotha. So they're, this kind of biblical image of these fallen workers. And what's really remarkable about that monument was this was not done after the fall of communism, but this was put up during Polish communism as a kind of protest against the way that people were being treated, which, in a way was very remarkable, sort of first public sign of resistance to communism that eventually led to the fall of communism in 1989. At the base of the monument are 2 epigraphs. The first is a poem in 4 stanzas that Miłosz wrote in the 1950s titled, You Who Wronged. Miłosz addressed his readers in the second person, starting with the stanza, You who wronged a simple man, bursting into laughter at the crime, and kept a pack of fools around you to mix good and evil, to blur the line. So these are the people that he's addressing, and it has, I think, a very biblical cadence to it. If you read the Psalms, it sounds like one of the Psalms. And Miłosz warns that the poet is not going to forget these misdeeds, even if others will. So the poem then continues, Do not feel safe. The poet remembers. You can kill one, but another is born. The words are written down, the deed, the date. So you can see why that would be an appropriate poem. It wasn't actually written for that occasion, but it was one that Miłosz had written before that was then used on that memorial. And the second epigraph of the monument comes from Psalm 29, which you read for us this morning. And Psalm 29 is a hymn of praise to the victorious Lord. The psalmist celebrates the victory of the Lord over the primeval waters of chaos, while confirming that the Lord remains sovereign over all the surrounding nations. So in that psalm, you have imagery of flaming fire, crashing timber, whirling storms, and they evoke awe and the heartfelt cry of glory in the temple. After this evocation of strength, the final two verses bring assurance that the Lord reigns forever over chaos, which no longer poses a threat to the people. And the concluding verses of the psalm bring blessing. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. And those verses are the ones that are printed across from this monument in Miłosz's Polish translation of Psalm 29. So in this monument, which is from, a kind of forgotten historical era now, we encounter poetry and the biblical text in formative dialogue, generating a vector of meaning that points away from totalitarianism towards an alternate future of hope and justice. And those final verses of Psalm 29 became a rallying cry in Poland during the 1980s as the Solidarity movement carried out a campaign of successful nonviolent resistance against the communist regime. Miłosz, who was exiled from his native land, returned after 1989 as a national hero. And the story reminds us that the words of poets have power, and when forged in dialogue with a biblical witness, can move mountains. Now, I want to share an interesting connection with you, which I think is fascinating, just in terms of this, poet from Poland seems like from far away. Even California is far away. But if you want to study Miłosz, you don't actually need to go to Vilnius or Warsaw or Berkeley. You just have to take the ferry and drive down to New Haven. Because through a series of purchases and donations, Yale now has Miłosz's personal papers and manuscripts, along with many other poetical luminaries, in its Beinecke Library. Now, if you know the Beinecke Library, how many of you have been to Beinecke? So if you know it, it's a beautiful white building in a square with translucent marble windows. It's a spectacular piece of architecture. But when Miłosz saw it, he slyly compared it to a columbarium because it also has a slight look of where his literary remains would be placed. And I think there's a poem called On Beinecke Library where he also celebrated, however glad he was to have his papers there, that he was still alive. So anyway, what I'd like to do now is just read one of my favorite poems from Miłosz, which I think, now that you've kind of had a sense of what he's like, this is a poem that, again, I come back to again and again. So I'll just read a poem if that's all right with you. It's called A Poem for the End of the Century, written at the end of the 1990s. When everything was fine, and the notion of sin had vanished, and the earth was ready, in universal peace, to consume and rejoice, without creeds and utopias, I, for unknown reasons, surrounded by the books of prophets and theologians, of philosophers, poets, searched for an answer, scowling, grimacing, waking up at night, muttering at dawn. What oppressed me so much was a bit shameful. Talking of it aloud would show neither tact nor prudence. It might even seem an outrage against the health of mankind. Alas, my memory does not want to leave me, and in it live beings, each with its own pain, each with its own dying, its own trepidation. Why then innocence on paradisal beaches, an impeccable sky over the church of hygiene? Is it because that was long ago? To a saintly man, so goes an Arab tale, God said somewhat maliciously, "Had I revealed to people how great a sinner you are, they could not praise you." "And I," answered the pious one, "had I unveiled to them how merciful you are, they would not care for you." To whom should I turn with that affair so dark, of pain and also guilt in the structure of the world? If either here below or over there on high, no power can abolish the cause and the effect. Don't think, don't remember the death on the cross, though every day he dies, the only one all-loving, who without any need consented and allowed to exist all there is, including nails of torture. Totally enigmatic, impossibly intricate. Better to stop speech here. This language is not for people. Blessed be jubilation, vintages and harvests, even if not everyone is granted serenity. So, to conclude, let me invite you during National Poetry Month to go over to the library. We have Milosz's works there along with many other poets, and pick out a volume of poetry. They're slim to read, and read one before the end of the month, because God knows that we could all use more poetry in our lives right now. Amen.
Amen.